Achtung! Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, of course. How are you, Jim?
Yeah, no, I'm good, thank you. How are you? You've been continuing the tour.
I'm into my last week now, so
congratulations!
There's actually an end post in sight.
That's exciting.
I was in Norwich last night, which was Sunday because we record these on a Monday. And where was I the day before that? I was in Hastings, and the day before that, I was in Chatham. We had a signing.
Okay, well, it sounds like your geography's getting a bit better.
Well, after Hastings, we drove to Cambridge because that split the journey to Norwich. So yeah, sure.
East, southeast. It's it's not quite kind of zigzagging from sort of Yeovil to Skegness.
Well, and then we go this week. We're going to Liverpool, then Warrington, then Aylesbury. So at least we're coming back down the map, and then Dublin on Sunday.
Fantastic!
Hurrah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. But you've been reading Alex's memoirs, haven't you? So I'm impressed.
I thought because of your sort of overpowering man crush on Harold Alexander, I thought what I should do. Well, you know what? They're a very interesting memoir. They're thin. It's not a blow by blow and I was white Montgomery effort. I was white and everyone else was a fool. It's not one of those jobs. And you very much get the sense of the man's self-confidence. You get the sense of the man's caliber in how he feels he ought to deal with people post-war. He only sets there's only a couple of things that obviously he feels he has to get down because he's really, really pissed off about them. But he presents it in such a sort of charming, gentlemanly way. You don't get they're a very interesting exercise. And like I say, a great contrast to sort of Monty's bullet-pointed way of going through the war. What's really interesting though is the way they're written because he starts in the desert and then he goes
it's not chronological at all.
Not one bit. And that's actually really, really, really interesting. It's not chronological and it goes backwards and forwards and sort of and some really interesting things where he says that that there was no, when the campaign ends, you have to sit down and write your dispatch yourself. And there's in the British Army at the time, there was no historian. There was no sense of having a historian who could keep track of stuff for you. So you have to sit down with your staff and go, right, what happened then, and figure it all out in retrospect. And he says the Americans are much more geared to this. They've got historians. They've got a thing worked out that they're sort of, they've got this business intellectually baked in. Whereas the British Army doesn't. And he essentially sort of says, after the end of the war, it's a colossal ball ache that they're sitting down and getting it written, which I think is a really interesting, that had never occurred to me. Well,
you can imagine that, can't you? Because, he's not sort of someone who's going to sit there reliving his glories. He's always someone who looks forward. So that was then and this is now. And why do you want to revisit this? Yeah. I mean, he really had to be pressured very, very strongly into doing his memoirs. He wasn't interested in doing them, and he got that guy to come and help him out.
Yeah.
But as I said to you, he's perfectly capable of writing very nicely.
Yeah.
I sent you a couple of letters.
Oh yeah, his personal letters are really, really funny.
They're really full of doodles.
Yeah. But it's really interesting though because obviously, the main reason I went to it is to read about Alamein, having done our Alamein week, to see what he has to say or what he's prepared to put on the record. And I find
he is prepared to put on the record, the fact that he was the first in and the first person to say there are going to be no withdrawals and the changing round of morale and everything that Monty does is rubber stamped by him first.
Well, yes, I cannot disguise that he was not an easy man to deal with. He says about Montgomery, but yet there is. He says that he says my first step in restoring morale, therefore, was to lay down the firm principle to be made known to all ranks that no further withdrawal was contemplated, that we would fight the coming battle on the ground on which we stood. General Montgomery fully concurred in this policy and communicated it to the 8th Army HQ to staff meeting.
So much so that he took it completely as his own.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There is no doubt at all that Montgomery, during his address, gave brilliant emphasis to the agreed policy. So, I mean, it is a combination of the plan devised and then the transmission of the plan. And I think it's very, very interesting as well, because he also says, I would hear interpolate a note addressed to military historians who are rightly meticulous in their examination of phraseology, particularly in dispatches, and have directed their attention to the paragraph in my own dispatch from which I've just quoted relating to the plan. A plan, I repeat, based on a key ridge, and therefore one that demanded little or nothing in the way of military appreciation. So he's basically saying the idea that they pinched Auchinleck's plan, that the people that preceded them's plan, is baloney, because it's the only ridge in the entire area. So what else are you going to do?
But done with such sort of understatement.
Exactly. A plan, I repeat, based on a key ridge, and therefore one that demanded little or nothing in the way of military appreciation. Although, as I've already indicated, the actual back pattern of the battle was exclusively Montgomery's. Thus, I would say that the plan devised itself by its obviousness. I mean, you are too smooth, mate. It's fantastic. When I referred in this particular paragraph to the plan, I was certainly not harking back to any plan formulated by my predecessor. So Alex is quite keen to firewall himself from that idea, But I mean, it's just that I am asked who saved the BEF. My reply is Hitler. I mean, he's just it's too good. Right. And I've enjoyed this memoir enormously. And the thing is, I think there's a photograph of my grandfather in it.
Yes, that's very exciting.
Of the Colonel's dad.
Of Popham.
Of Popham, as we used to call him, who was a part of Macmillan's political crew, and who went to Greece with Churchill. And there's a photograph of a torchlit meeting.
Yes.
With it's Makarios, isn't it? And those people. And it's absolutely I sent it to my father last night. Said, do you think he's somewhere in this photo? And he said, well, no, actually, I think that's probably him far left, and that's his ear. And it's Macmillan. Damaskinos is who it is. Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden on the right.
The Archbishop.
Photo. Yeah, the Archbishop. When they're trying to sort of shoehorn a political deal onto the Greeks. And my father thinks that my grandfather is extreme left in the photo, so you can see his ear and half his face. And I think he's right. I think that might be him.
Well, I think it must be incredibly thrilling for you to have a grandfather who's touched by the greatness of Alex.
It's extraordinary, and the story of them being in the armored car with the bullets pinging off them on the way to their meeting. Anyway, enough of my family. We've some and stuff with some emails that we should just.
Well, yes, I should just say also that I've been having before we get onto the emails and questions.
AOB, yeah,
AOB. Very much so. I've been reading an absolutely fascinating master's thesis this weekend.
Yeah,
by Pete Connor, who's a New Zealander, and he actually now works for Wingnut Films, which is Peter Jackson's thing.
Yeah,
but in a former life, he was doing an MA, and he did a study of 24 Battalion.
Right.
So all the battalions, they didn't have sort of exciting names like the Hastings and Prince Edward or the Durham Light Infantry or the Green Howards or anything like that. They were just numbered, both in Australians and the New Zealanders. The New Zealanders had 28 battalion was the Maori battalion.
Yeah. And
24 was just an infantry battalion. And it's really fascinating because he did this, he wrote this in, I think, 2005, 2006.
Yeah.
And so there were still plenty of veterans to talk to. He managed to winkle out some written stuff as well. There was a very, very detailed series of official histories that were put out, some 72 official histories of various parts of the New Zealand division and New Zealand army in the Second World War. And 24 Battalion is really interesting because, of course, it's at Sidi Rezegh.
Yeah.
Then it's at Alamein.
Yeah.
Then it's in Italy.
Yeah.
And the churn is just phenomenal. And what's really interesting about the stuff on the by the Italian bit, so they do really, really well at Sidi Rezegh. They do pretty well in Alamein as well. But by the time they got to Italy, Pete Connor reckons they're starting to kind of he thinks they're a bit done. And he was saying that by 1945 44, I think there's all 45. There's 131,000 troops in the New Zealand army, which represents something like 19% of the population.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which makes you realise just how small New Zealand is as a population in the 1940s.
And also why the furlough mutiny must be...
the furlough stuff is really,
it's the elephant in the room, isn't it? Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So check this out. So from January to February 1944, for example, he says, the battalion lost on average 4.62 personnel per day to illness and enemy action. While some of the wounded, 47% of the losses, and the majority of the illness evacuations, 41.2% of the losses, would have returned to the battalion eventually, such was the rate of personnel turnover that 24 battalion losses equated to its establishment of personnel in a period of little more than 4 months. You know, if you've got an 800 strong, 900 strong battalion. And what I'm starting to realise is, and they also have these spikes. They have casualty spikes.
Yes.
The casualty spikes are when you're in action. And quite often this means a whole section or an overwhelming percentage of a platoon gone.
Yeah.
Which then has to be replaced. And what he argues, and argues very convincingly, is that the training they're getting back home in New Zealand is not fit for the work they've got to do in here. So it's lots of route marches, it's sort of blancoing, it's sort of making your bed straight, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of charging your bayonet at a sack. Not much work with a pier, not much work with Bren guns. Most people, there's a guy, he cites a guy who arrives in Italy and put on a Bren gun. He's never fired a Bren gun in his life. Okay, well,
so basically,
how hard can it be?
So word isn't getting back to New Zealand of what needs to be done in terms of training.
But then he's saying when they're in the Western Desert, when they're in the Middle East, what they're getting is long periods out of the line for retraining.
Yeah.
And obviously before Alamein, for example, they get a big period of retraining because they're not actually involved in the Gazala battles, for example. So they're all training out there in the right conditions. And whether the training's right or wrong, they're getting lots of training.
Yeah.
But such is the paucity of troops in Italy, and so they're so scraping the barrel because troops are needed elsewhere, for Overlord and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
That actually the training periods they got. So there's a bit at the end of January before they go into the line in February, where they have 2 days of training and then they have 3 days of relaxation going around Pompeii.
Oh, right, okay.
Well, which you could argue is more important than the training.
Yes, you could argue if you're what Freiberg has to say about this stage is really, really interesting. He says, because he gets in his head that the men aren't as tough as they were in the previous war. So he says, we've got to a stage which was reached the last war, whereby encouragement and discipline, people have got to be made to fight. We have to fight now with some second-class material. The Germans are doing it, and we have to harden our heart to make as many fight as possible.
And when's he saying that?
This is during Third Casino. So
right. Okay. That is absolutely the conclusion that Pete comes to.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating because so what happens is in New Zealand it's not the same as the British Army. New Zealand are a dominion; they can do things however they like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're much smaller, so none of the rules that would apply to kind of recruitment in Britain apply in New Zealand, or very few of them. So what they have is they have this initial draft, and then they have reinforcements.
Yeah.
And basically you are eligible for the draft at 18, but you can't go and serve overseas until you're 21.
Yeah.
So you have these reinforcements. And mid 1944, you're reaching the 10th reinforcement. So most of the troops at Casino are from the 8th reinforcement. Yeah. And one of the reasons why these reinforcements, sailing them over to has been accelerated, is because of these furloughs.
Yeah.
So there is the Raupehu draft. I hope I've pronounced that right.
That's right. There's the Raupehu draft and the Wakatipu draft.
Yes. So the Raupehu draft is the one that happens in July 1943. So Tunisia's over. It's all done. They've done, Takruna and Feederville, all the rest of it. They've had a hell of a time. They've basically been in the front line ever since Alamein, the previous July. So they've had 10 months in the front line. They've done 130 days of combat.
Yes, they've done everything
in that period.
Yeah.
Since they first arrived. the New Zealand Division, Second New Zealand Division, or the Second New Zealand Expeditionary Forces, give it this correct title.
Yeah.
And so 6,000 of these first 3 echelons that have been sent out there are eligible to return.
Yeah.
Now, what happens with the New Zealand force is that once you've been in the front line long enough, it is recognised that you've done your bit. So then you get put into the echelons. You become a supply troops, driving a truck, whatever.
Yeah.
Out of the line. You're at, battalion headquarters, whatever. So you're not in those sort of rifle companies anymore.
Yeah.
So a lot of those 6,000 are men that have already been taken out of the rifle companies. But of course, that then puts on greater pressure on the supplies.
Yeah.
Whichever way you cut it, you're 6,000 men down.
Yeah.
And then you've got the second draft for furlough. And what this means is that, as Jonathan Fennell writes, and as you've been pointing out, is you've suddenly got this gap by March 1944, where you've still got some diehards there, but you haven't got enough. You've got a lot of people that are coming in, replacements, who are not particularly well trained. And in the past, that wouldn't have mattered because you come to you do your basics over in New Zealand, you get on the ship, you come over. Other interesting thing is you when you might be an officer or an NCO in New Zealand for training, which you've earned those stripes because you join at 18, and by the time you're 20 or 21, you've actually done sufficiently good enough to kind of get promoted. But when you arrive in the Middle East or when you arrive in Italy, you're demoted a stripe.
Yeah.
So there's no officer, there's no Sandhurst equivalent.
No.
The officers are the officers because they're a cut above the others, and they've shown obvious leadership and an aptitude and courage and all that kind of stuff, and just sort of leadership of men. So quite often a first lieutenant might arrive in the Middle East and then be reduced to a sergeant, and a sergeant reduced to a corporal. And very often you'll quickly get that back again. And there's a kind of understanding of this. So it's not like it's a shock. So everyone's up for it, and it doesn't cause any resentment or anything. But the whole process works because in the Western Desert, you have these periods of training and acclimatization and all the rest of it, and stint in the canal zone. But in Italy, such is the paucity of troops that there's no time for that. So you're just shoved in.
Well, this is what Freiberg has to say. And he says in the writing to the Prime Minister on the 6th of June, 1944, right? And there's the idea is that Second New Zealand Division is like a family business. It's like, and where everyone's a shareholder, because that's the New Zealand way of doing things. But he says the inevitable effect of fierce fighting over a long period on even the best troops in the world is becoming apparent. There is no doubt in my mind that the high watermark of our battle worthiness was reached at Sidi Rezeg and Belhamid in November 1941. Yes. So he's saying, so we've had 3 years since. In that campaign and the other costly Western Desert battles which followed, many of our best men became casualties, and gradually the keen fighting edge of the force was blunted. For a period, the gradual reduction in offensive spirit was offset by the increased efficiency of the divisional machine and the ever-increasing battle experience of our commanders. Time has gone on. Another long campaign in Italy has followed. I know the great stress of battle which large numbers of men have been through, and we cannot disregard its effect, especially on battle-weary leaders. Signs are not lacking now that many of the old hands require a prolonged rest. I have come to the conclusion that the time may well be opportune for the complete withdrawal of 2 NZEF. Isn't that amazing?
It's absolutely amazing.
We are done. We've run out of people. We've ground through the good people. They're all gone, and the quality of the fighting's too difficult. It's too hard.
And you know what? Are they withdrawn?
No, of course not. No,
they're not. I mean, it's really, really, it really is interesting. And the one thing that's hitting me really clearly, and actually when I stop and think about it, I'm not surprised about, is that all these battalions are under strength all the time.
Yeah. And
the traditional narrative in Italy is that, okay, so we had parity of divisions, but at least we had, they were full strength, whereas, Germans are operating at 50% strength or less or whatever. Yeah. What's really interesting is that in terms of fighting strength, which is what you're talking about, the Allied battalions aren't much better. No. They're maybe 60% or 70% strength, but they're certainly not 100.
Well, funnily enough, that's a point Alex makes at the end of his memoir, where he basically says there's no point counting divisions to know what anyone's fighting strength is. you're wasting your time if you try and look at what was happening in Italy by going, oh, there's 25 of us and 32 of them or whatever. It's a pointless exercise because after all, we have a big tail and fighting strength because of the relentlessness of the fighting is this, that, and the other. I mean, what's interesting is Freiberg is describing the fighting in Italy at this time is as bad as the last war. He says it's the same as the last war. We're being put through the same thing, and at second casino 816 casualties, third casino it's 2,106 losses for the Kiwis.
That's such a lot of your fighting strength. When you think your maximum fighting strength is about 9,500.
Yeah,
in a full strength division.
Yeah. And he, but
if you're already kind of at 60%, then that's about a third of your force.
Exactly.
Your fighting force.
And he writes to Clark on the 3rd of April, says, we failed. Sorry, we didn't accomplish our mission, capture Casino. And then he writes to Lease a week later. He writes to Lease for handing over to 13 Corps, giving them such a difficult position. He knows it's got. I mean, what's interesting is Freiberg is telling everyone it's gone wrong. And, again, Jonathan, according to Jonathan, the mailbag is full of people calling despondent about the casualties. The census report, they're despondent. And some people are calling Freiberg a butcher because of what's happened.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
It is amazing. The thing is this isn't a sideshow. What's going, sideshow.
No, it isn't.
Sideshow implies that the fighting is, I don't know, somehow less stressful or less important, but it's
actually about as tough as it gets, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's tying up the Germans, and it's this whole thing that these are divisions the Germans can't. It's divisions we can't. The British, the Americans, the Allies can't deploy elsewhere, but it's certainly divisions that Germans can't deploy elsewhere.
We've got a question that touches on that.
Well, should we
come to it?
I tell you what,
should we do that?
We've even got a script this week.
What?
The old days.
The shock, the horror. Maybe we should read these little messages out first, and then we'll go to questions after.
So this one's from Ollie Martin. I don't know if you know the story of the 160 airmen of Buchenwald, but as the grandson of one of them, I've spent a lot of time researching my grandfather's story. How, as an RAF fighter pilot, he was shot down over occupied France. How he evaded capture and worked with the Maquis, how he was betrayed in Paris by the Gestapo and incarcerated in is it Fresnes or Freyne?
I think it must be Freyne, mustn't it?
Freyne, I think, prison, only to be transported to Buchenwald concentration camp with 167 fellow Allied airmen and sentenced to death, only to be rescued by the Luftwaffe. They spent the rest of the war in prisoner of war camps, but were involved in 2 additional force marches before eventually stealing a VW and escaping back to England. Wow, that's a heck of a story.
I didn't know that.
We know that we need that in full, Ollie, when you've researched it. That's extraordinary.
Come back to us.
I mean, interesting. The Luftwaffe intervening. That's but when is that in the war? Because after all, later stages of the war,
at the end, isn't it? Because the Luftwaffe sort of they mutiny, don't they, against Germany?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, they do.
Mackie Steinhoff
That's Steinhoff and Galland as well, doesn't it? They
say
it's
all part of that.
We can't do this. This is and here's one from Gary Calderwood, which is curious. I was unaware that during the Second World War, the government introduced double British summertime, 2 hours extra daylight to save energy. Yes. How much energy did this save? Do you guys know anything about this? Was it successful? I imagine it was.
Well, yeah, that's why it's so light. And that's why in France, they think of the liberation as, the first house to be liberated was 11:30 at night.
Oh, yes.
But from Britain, it's 12:30.
Well,
confusing your D-days.
Was it
the 5th? Was it the 6th? Oh.
Those differences are important. Yes. Was it the 5th or the 6th? That's a very good.
And the Germans were operating at a different time, weren't they?
Yes, they were. But the landings that arrive on D-1 are on D-. The 6th of June is D-Day. Let's
no, there's no question about that. But we think the first people touched down at 13 minutes past,
midnight.
At midnight. But
yeah, but
it's the 6th of June as far as we're concerned, and frankly, that's all that matters.
That's all that matters. Right, and then from Michael Carpenter, my grandparents lived in Mudderford, Dorset, opposite the airfield there. During the war, they built Horsa gliders at the airspeed factory. Whenever we used to walk our dog with my dad over the airfield, we used to pass the tubular wreckage of light aircraft in the brambles. My grandfather was was a local policeman during the war, and he always told me it was the wreckage of a small plane that 2 German lads flew from Germany escaping the Nazis. Have you ever heard this story?
No.
We'll have to look that up, won't we? Mudford. I mean, what would it have been? A Fiesler Storch or something, or a Bouchon, or some light aircraft escaping?
I don't know. I mean, but there are lots of stories that get distorted. So a fellow was talking to me the other day, and he said, his grandfather used to work at a factory making gearboxes for Cromwell tanks. And he said the amazing thing was just before the war or something, the Germans came over or I don't know, they captured something. And anyway, and it ended up being the basis of the Tiger tank. And my grandfather always said that, they were still, they're still finding bits of old Cromwell gearbox that were used for Tiger tanks in Regensburg or somewhere like that. And I said, well, I don't think that can be true, because the gearbox of a Tiger was a totally different beast to that of the Churchill tank.
Yeah.
Very, very complex, designed by Ferdinand Porsche. And he went, oh, well, thanks for putting me right. but, these stories come down, and it might just have been some tubular piping from something completely different.
That's funny. That's very good.
I don't know. Anyway.
We don't know. Yeah. Well, although there were plenty of defectors, so there were
so it might well be. He might well be.
He might well be.
He might be right. He might be wrong.
Amazing story about the defectors someone was telling me about, where they tried twice. There's a crew in a Heinkel who tried twice. They landed and they got out, and they went to the control tower, and the control tower drew pistols on them. So they ran away and got back in the Heinkel and flew off again back to Germany.
Really?
And then 3 months later turned up again. Yeah. And then they ended up in
trying again.
But the pilot was a communist, apparently, in the Luftwaffe, and he ended up in Niesden, which is where MI6 used to keep people like Pedestal, in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
Which is where the sort of shadow, which is where the new intelligence.
We should do something on sort of strange but true.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Weird, funny things that sort of
strange but true. Who'd have thunk it? Yes.
Who'd have thunk it? Yeah.
Right. Should we take a break and then do some questions?
Yeah, that's very exciting.
Why not? We will be back in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, the Second World War podcast for all your Second World War needs. By the way, on the subject of Second World War needs, have you got your copy of The Tiger Feeble yet, Jim?
Yes, I have. I haven't looked at it yet. Is it quite sexy?
It is very sexy, and it's got any book that comes with pull-out schematics.
Yes, very strong.
Is very, very, very strong. A tiger. That's from the Tank Museum.
Rachel's cousin yesterday told me about Travel Man, which I'd never watched before.
Oh yeah,
with Richard Iowada, and the first one we watched was him with Noel Fielding in Copenhagen, and it was just so funny hearing someone talking exactly like you do when you're doing Dutch.
I also got Martin Davidson's new book, Mobilising Hate.
That's incredibly exciting.
It's really good as well.
I've got to read that in very quick order.
Yes, I need to read it.
Give him a massive
pass. And then someone sent me this.
Oh yes,
Hellfire,
featuring
Jack Tenor.
Jack Tenor.
August 1942, North Africa.
Well, I was thinking, just in we've never done that as an audio for the Patreon.
No, we haven't, have we? Maybe.
I mean, I'd like to think you're in for a treat, but
okay, I can get that done. Anyway, should we do these questions?
Yes.
Okay, so we asked over the weekend for questions, and many flew in. This is a great question. Aidan O'Sullivan asks, for the British infantry soldier who served and survived the war from 1939 to 1945, what would he have noticed as big changes in the nature of his service experience, e.g., leadership, information, equipment, food? Well, I think
that's such a great question.
I mean,
and the danger, of course, is that we spend the next 25 minutes covering that and nothing else.
I mean, massive,
quite a lot, a massive amount. I think. On the first of all, a huge surge in confidence, I would say, in terms of the back support.
Yeah.
In terms of, it makes a massive difference when you can see bombers going over and fighter planes going over, and they're on your side rather than the other.
Yeah,
that's a massive difference. I think the scale of the operation that you're part of, I think you would have felt a pretty small fish in a pretty small pond in 1940, but I think you would have felt a very small fish in a giant pond by 1944, 45.
Yes.
Food doesn't really change much. That's much the same, really. Leadership, I think, would have improved, generally speaking, for the most part, certainly at the higher level anyway.
Yep.
We've talked about that kind of sort of that sort of crux point in August 1942, where sort of to a certain extent before that, the kind of leadership isn't great. And after that, it's much improved. And obviously that's a sweeping statement, but it's a marked one all the same, I think, for the most part. I think information was better.
Yeah, well, and the Army Education Corps comes into, it swings into view, doesn't it? And you get that, you get a change in engagement between the army and the people in it in terms of telling them what they're fighting for and what's going on.
Yes.
I think the training, the kit. I mean, the kit changes, doesn't it? So the kit it gradually improves. You come away from the old SMLE and into the Mark IV with the pig sticker bayonet. Come away from the swords. The kit sort of updates itself and combs through. I mean, obviously the training varies, and the training varies depending on the taste, essentially, of your battalion commander. So the degree to which you're learning about the new kit as it comes in. So a thing like a Piat, it varies to how much actual experience you've got using that new weapon, but you will notice that it's that stuff's coming online. In theory, you're doing more physical fitness as well. Fitness becomes much more of a thing.
Battle schools, I think, have a big
battle
impact.
Schools, yeah. So an awful lot changes, and I think you probably find that the army is taking probably better care of you than if you were a professional soldier in the 1930s.
I think the other thing is a small unit, comparatively small unit, where I'm talking about sort of battalion or armoured regiment strength or gun battery or whatever, or field regiment. I think at that level, it's vastly improved because the people who are now the half colonels are people who started off the war as captains and majors, and they've survived, and they're experienced and they know what they're talking about, and they've been in the desert and they've been in Italy and they've been around the block and they know what they're doing, and for the most part, you get to be a battalion commander because you've earned that right. Now, obviously, again, there's always exceptions. There's always some sort of pretty crap people who kind of sneak in there somehow through the back door. But for the most part, that's why you're getting people like Stanley Christopherson and John Semkin at the Sherwood Rangers, for example, and why the Sherwood Rangers become so good, because they've learned the hard lessons and they're still standing and they're able to apply that. And there's just no substitute for battlefield experience. And that is just filtered down, and the good people make sure they filter it down. So I think the changes are considerable.
Well, they're top down and they're top down and they're bottom up, aren't they?
Exactly.
That's what's quite interesting about it. Is that and the sort of they meet in the middle, and obviously you do have, you've got people resistant to Adam's reforms. I think it's very interesting. Adam at one point considers bringing back the death penalty. I mean, he's got.
Yes, I know he does. Yeah,
which is really interesting because he does have. There's this idea that he's a sort of, liberal, and Churchill thinks he's too lefty and all that sort of thing. but at the same time, he is looking for how to make the army work, and considers bringing back the death penalty at one point as a way to do that, because that's actually what he's interested in. That's actually what he's trying to achieve. He isn't bringing these things in because he's some sort of
he's a complete bastard. It's because
he
wants
or the things that appear soft to some people because he's some sort of metropolitan liberal elite person. He's just very clever and is wondering what are the best pragmatic solutions to mobilise the army. Anyway, that's a
great question for Maiden.
An amazing question, and I would suggest, Aidan, if you want to read about that, Alan Allport, and I'm such a fanboy of Alan's, but his book Browned Off and Bloody Minded, Alan Allport's Browned Off and Bloody Minded, about the British soldier in the Second World War, is the one you want to read on that subject. David Dickinson, surely not the David Dickinson, the Tangerine.
No, he's a different David Dickinson. He's part of the Dorset IC.
That's right. Okay, thank you.
He's a lovely chap.
He's just finished watching the excellent BBC Rogue Hero series. What a blast! What is your standout moment or theme, and why? Mine was the banter, the sheer audacity and skills, but mostly their ability to think beyond normal military groupthink of the time. Incredible. Well, what I loved about the show was what I feel it's doing is it's trying to tell an eternal story about men who love war and what that does to them. That's the
I'd agree with that. I would say David, I would issue a word of caution here in believing that what you're seeing on screen is anything like the reality. Take it for what it is, which is a really cracking, good adventure story and wartime drama.
Yeah.
But the banter is absolutely not how it was at all. It was completely, totally, banter written for the 21st century. The audacity and skills, yes, okay, I'll give that. Think beyond the normal military group thing. Well, yeah, but I think quite a few people are starting to think outside the box by that stage.
Well, I mean, it's been
the LRDG
but it's been encouraged. Wavell, who is where the buck stops for quite a while. When he's running things in Palestine, he's looking for people who are unconventional. So basically, he can do things under the radar and on the cheap, which is how, after all, Wingate gets Wavell's attention in the first place.
Yes.
So pre-war, and particularly in the desert, where you're trying to address how you get around in the desert and what you're going to do, and also you don't really know. After all, the war that you end up fighting in the desert in 1941 is not the one you were considering in 1938-39, when they start thinking about what they're going to have to do. They're not expecting the Germans in that part of the world. They're expecting to deal with the Italians. But there is very much this idea that unconventional warfare is actually how you're going to do things in that part of the world, because you're also trying to save money, and do things on the cheap. And that's where the LRDG are very much part of. How do we solve the problem of the desert? Long-range penetration. It's how we've done things colonially and in Africa. This entire time was with long-range penetration. We've been doing this for a century.
Yep.
So it's an updated way of looking at that. So I mean, if that's what's quite. I think this sort of picture, once you zoom out of the Second World War and look at a longer tradition of how you do your soldiering in Africa, that kind of stuff fits with it.
Absolutely. But David, I just want to be absolutely clear about this. The banter was not realistic. David Sterling didn't go around sort of going, "Who the fuck are you?" and Paddy Mayne didn't go around sort of going, so now it's a competition, is it? Right. Yeah, he didn't say that either. There was no
kill
competition.
All of you.
I kill all of you. Perius. And But also the City Hadish one, where you've got in the TV series, you've got David Sterling kind of hurtling down with the jeeps, shooting everything up. That was actually the entire regiment at the time that was involved in that on the 27th of July, 1942. And Paddy Mayne led one column and Sterling led another. There was no competition about scores whatsoever. It's just absolute baloney. But I agree, it was great fun.
I mean, the thing is, I think
even the M60.
Even the M60. Well, yes, I know.
So my friend at Bear Arms, who did all the
kit
weaponry for it, he just said, "Look, yeah, I know." He said it was gutting. He said it was just devastating. But he said the cost of getting a proper Panzer out there to southern Tunisia just couldn't be done.
Don't worry about it, everybody.
I know. I want to get him on. Actually, he's up for coming on because he does loads and loads of weaponry for these things. That's what he does. He supplies it and trains them and all the rest of it.
I mean, I'd love to know the K guns, the Vickers K guns.
Yes, exactly.
They must be rubber models. They can't be any left.
I don't know. But anyway, he's got this fantastic range near Bridport where you can go and fire all this stuff. It's great.
Why are you just telling me this now? What?
Well, he's invited us down.
He's invited doing this podcast.
He's invited us down. He's invited us down. Anyway, I think we should go down there and record one with him. Absolutely. But anyway, he's fascinating. I'm very interested in getting people on who aren't sort of, we always assume it's just going to be other historians.
Yeah.
I think you sent over a note at the weekend. I think that was a really good idea to get people who make us think about all this in a slightly different way.
Yeah. Well, I've got a comedian friend who has a Stars in Battle dress thing he wants to talk to us about, which is all the people in the Second World War who, did entertainment and then became stars in the 50s. Anyway, Thomas Abrahams asks, keeping it Alamein related, if Rommel had been victorious in North Africa, how influential could it have been on the Eastern Front? Could it have helped Germany defeat the USSR? Well, I mean, the thing is, he's not going to be victorious. I can't do this. I can't think of the circumstances.
I would say
and what constitute.
And I'll tell you for why. Because they're going to get to the oil fields and they're going to have exactly the same problem that they have when they get to Baku, if indeed they do get to Baku in Azerbaijan, that they've got no means of refining it or indeed transporting it. Because Middle East oil fields are really, really underdeveloped at this stage. And they're in the middle of the desert. And the Germans, and indeed the Italians, simply do not have the means of transporting it. Because ultimately, it's got to go by ship. There's no, even if they've got enough shipping to get it to, so how would that work? So they bring it up to Suez, then they get to, they've got Alexandria, so they ship it out of Alexandria. In what? I mean, they just don't have enough.
Well, and also, Royal Navy then diverts its effort to sinking all that oil. All of its submarine effort to sinking that oil.
Yeah. So it's just. So no, it's just not going to work. I mean, there was, Hitler's big plan was to join up the two, so you've got Rommel kind of surging forward and North Africa into the Middle East. You've got the Case Blue surging down to the Caucasus in the summer of 1942. And, bingo, they all meet up and it's all, happy days. But again, there's no means of transporting all this stuff. So no, I don't think it would have made any difference because, we're not using the Suez Canal anyway.
No, we're not. No. Well,
and even if the Axis have got the Suez Canal, even if the Axis have got the Suez Canal, it's not got nothing to go through it because they haven't got any shipping.
Yeah. Let's go on to Adam Presswich's question, which is kind of related. What was the reliability quality of Allied kit and equipment versus Axis? How did this change during the war as mass production was ramped up and new designs were accelerated into production?
Well, I think Adam must be a new listener to the podcast. I have mentioned it once or twice over the last 500 episodes.
Well, I mean, it gets the Allied kit. They do cut corners and they do try and do things, as cheaply as possible. But the kit, especially stuff that's made. I mean, one of the things to bear in mind is there's a difference between the British version of mass production, the American version of mass production. The American version of mass production is true Henry Ford mass production, where everything's identical, everything's made the same way, per factory. So, a Detroit Sherman might be different from one made somewhere else, but they're the same, aren't they?
And there's lots of crossover of parts.
So
the protection cover on a Jeep will be exactly the same as it is on a truck.
And the lamps are the same and everything's the same. So they're all interchangeable so that you only need the one bulb or whatever. British mass production is still essentially workshop mass production. So you have enormous workshops. So no two Churchill tanks are exactly the same, for instance, because they're produced in that sort of British workshop style. This was really clearly illustrated to us when we went to Biggin Hill, and Peter Monk was telling us about how the way Spitfires are all different. They are. You can have, and he'll have 4 Spitfires up on jigs in his workshop, and they are all completely different because Doris did the panels one day on the bottom of the wing.
And Felicity did it the next.
And Felicity did it the next, and they drill it individually, and there is no template. They've got to put 30 rivets across or whatever, a panel left to right, and they do it their own way. Whereas the Mustang, by contrast, is properly mass-produced identically. And so that's why and then German mass production is like that but more so. Yeah. It's even more workshop production, which is after all. David Willey pointed this out to me. He said, if you're the Germans and you're building tanks, you can't mass produce like the Allies do, and the British have got their form of workshop mass production pretty good by 1943-44. It's working very well. Certainly in aircraft production, it's working exceptionally well, even though every Spitfire is its own unique snowflake of an aeroplane, as it were. The Germans, they can't produce at the output. So that's why you end up with Tiger tanks. That's why you end up with less of something bigger and more ridiculous, as it were.
Yeah.
Because you can't
compete mass production, so you might as well produce something that's exceptional but a fewer number. That's the idea behind it. But they also are the quality of workmanship is getting worse and worse.
It's getting worse and worse and worse
because of the people they're using in the factories.
Yeah. Because they've run out of labour. They're using slave labour, prisoners of war. And
they're also mass producing vast numbers of kind of very, very cheap bits of kit, such as a Panzerfaust and all the rest of it, which you can make in for two bob.
Yeah.
Or two Pfennigs or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting. If you know the Cosford, the RAF Museum at Cosford, for example, they've got an example of a Focke-Wulf 190, and it's quite a late war model of the 190, and it's really, really rough around the edges. It's incredible. None of the panels fit together.
Yeah.
They're all rough, and you know it is absolutely not Vorsprung Dutch technique at all.
No, it's banged out in a hurry because after all the Germans have got themselves in this double bind if they need to defend their airspace because it's under such colossal pressure, and also Speer knows that the way to get on with his boss is to go to him and say, look at these incredible numbers of fighters I'm producing. So the Germans find themselves in this double squeeze of producing lots of stuff because that's politically expedient.
Yes,
for the politicians involved, and also because that's the defense pressure you're under. Yeah. So he delivers on both counts, but then of course there's, as we said, there's no oil because so you can't fly the bloody things.
That's why they're ME 109Gs because they haven't got the right parts because they haven't got ball bearings, so they're using something else. Yeah, and so the engine gets too hot, and so then it catches fire. But I mean, if you want to look, Adam, if you want to understand the brilliance of German engineering at in 1939, for example, you want to strip down an MG-34, which is an absolute wonder to hold. If you strip down the whole thing and look at all the component parts and look at the breech mechanism, for example, it is just stunning. It is.
It's the Purdy of submachine guns, isn't it?
It's just
as high end as it could be.
It's about as a machine gun, it is as high end as it possibly could be, and obviously that is completely unsustainable.
Yeah, well, and the MP-44, the world's first assault rifle, supposedly,
is just hammered out.
Well, and the point of it is it's pressed plates, isn't it? That's the point of it, because that's easier and cheaper and quicker to manufacture than a rifle.
And it's light. It's really light. The MP-44.
Yeah, but because what you're trying to do is make things really quickly and cheaply. Yeah, and also and then some of the sort of explanation of that it's about a spray and pray weapon, because after all, marksmanship isn't the point anymore. Actually, the thing driving it is how do we make something dirt cheap?
Yeah, and quickly, and lots of them,
and that's easy to hand to someone who you haven't got to spend ages on a range teaching marksmanship to.
You just spray around.
Yeah, and
that's the lesson they've learned from the PPSH, which is a Prussian submachine.
And I think that you end up the AK-47 is the sort of is the conclusion that the Russians come to at the end of the Second World War, and they are the masters of cheap as chips mass production, and they've learned that from the Germans. But they've improved the quality of the thing. They've made it more robust and made it work better. You know, the idea, the concept. I mean, they look the same, but they're not the same thing. But I think that's what's gone on, is that the Germans, I mean, and it's like all of the German war effort, which starts off snazzy and sort of full of intent. And by the end
it's
of it,
all a bit shabby and down
it's pillar to post. They're staggering from decision to decision because of the pressure they've put themselves, the pressure they've walked themselves into, walked into.
Should we try and do a couple more quickly before we
Mark Gateby, why were the church bells rung after Alamein? There had been other long westward advances before. Why was this one seen as different at the time? Love the pod, by the way. Watch the full back catalogue. Well, it's because it is actually, everyone knows that this is a victory in the desert.
This is a British and Duke forces victory against German forces, and it's the first one in the field.
And it's unequivocal as well. It's not like Crusader, where you've ended up basically going as far as you possibly can and ending up a gum tree as a result, and shattering your own morale in the process. It's a calculated victory.
I think there is a palpable sense this is a turning point, because don't forget, just around the corner is going to be Torch, and so suddenly there is a path ahead where basically they can't fail. So they know it's a great victory. So Churchill says, I think we need to give everyone a lift. We've been in the war a long time. It's time to do it. And the whole point was that the church bells weren't allowed to peal for the duration of the war. So we're going to break this rule and have a bit of a knees up and a bit of a celebration and pat ourselves on the back. And it'll give everyone a massive morale boost. And frankly, it did, because there's nothing, for for your true Englishman or Briton, there's nothing like hearing the kind of the joyous peal of church bells to kind of give you an uplift and feel reassured that all is well with the world.
Well, and the thing is, we're talking 80 years ago when church bells and aircraft were the loudest things you'd ever hear in your life.
Yes, that is also true. But also, it's a reminder, isn't it, of the importance played by the church this time. This idea that God's on your side, that we're C of E and, sort of Christian nation. We're following kind of Christian morals, the kind of principles of the Ten Commandments, all the rest of it. Democracy, freedom, being nice to one another, all that kind of stuff. It's all tied in with that. And I think as a morale boosting piece of propaganda, it was a really, really good idea.
Yeah. And one last one, and this is the most spectacular can of worms. Yes. Nick Hall asks, if ultra intelligence was so advanced, why did the Battle of the Bulge seemingly take the Allies by surprise?
Well, it's because ultra can be a double-edged sword, Nick. Yep. That's why. And actually, if you want to find out a bit more about this, I mean, obviously we can tell you now in 2 minutes, but Peter Caddick Adams has done a whole chapter of this in his book Snow and Steel about the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant.
And it's a brilliant chapter, and it explains very clearly, very thoroughly, the complexities of intelligence. And Peter argues, and I would say argues very convincingly, and I completely agree with him, that because Ultra was so secret during the war, and until 1974 or whenever it was all revealed, and now we revere the Bletchley Park lot so much, and rightly so, to be fair.
Yeah.
We are in danger of overemphasizing its importance.
Yes.
And Peter's argument, and again, I completely concur with this, is that Ultra is one cog in multiple cogs that add up considerably more than the sum of their individual parts when they are put together.
And the mistake that was made wasn't really ultra related. The Germans went into radio silence, and no one interpreted that as, well, they're up to something. Why is it gone quiet?
Yeah. So it wasn't an ultra thing, was it? Does
that not presage an offensive? That they've gone quiet, and the Americans. Trent Telenko on Twitter is someone he tweeted a really, really long thread about this a while ago, about how basically within the USAAF, the Americans had someone at the time going, look, this all points directly to an offensive. And him being told to shut up because it didn't fit the intelligence picture, and it didn't fit the broad front picture that people wanted to look at. And because the Americans, they had an electronic warfare squadron, didn't they? And they'd been out trying to find out what was going on, and the silence wasn't interpreted as a sign that something was coming, which is clearly an important lesson to learn. But yes, Ultra's just part of the picture. Also, Ultra can tell you what dispositions are, but very often it couldn't tell you intentions. So you couldn't really glean what was going to happen next very often. You could tell who was where and what, but you couldn't actually. It was very hard from reading Ultra to know actually what the Germans are planning on doing. And also, it got difficult to know what strengths were and stuff. So you'd have, say, an SS Panzer Division, say, resting up somewhere, but you wouldn't know what its strength was necessarily.
And you wouldn't know what it was about to do either.
You wouldn't know what it was about to do, and you wouldn't know it. It'd be very hard to read its morale and its motivation and what's going on inside.
And the truth of the matter is, it made no military sense whatsoever to launch a major attack at this time of year at this particular point by the Germans. So that's why they didn't pick it. What I'm going to mention is also there's a few other questions that we haven't got time to answer, but I think deserve their entire pod on them. So Mark Milsom says, I've often wondered about the other Axis powers and their motivation for coming in with Germany. Hungary and Romania. Chancellors, what did they offer? Were there any equivalents in the Japanese sphere of influence? Well, I think all those particularly those East European countries, I think they deserve absolutely deserve some pods on their own. Another one was Ian says, any chance you could do an episode about the neutral countries in the European theatre during the war, specifically Sweden, Switzerland, Portugal? Yeah, again, that needs another one.
Well,
Todd Kehoe says, how about the Forgotten Fleet and how it played a part in the Far East? The British Pacific Fleet took down the Sumatran oil refineries in January for Operation Iceberg 1 and 2, plus carrier strikes on Japan. Last VC was a Brit Corsair pilot, Hammy Gray. Well, there's several podcasts to be done on that. There's probably a whole one just on Hammy Gray, to be honest, and British Corsair pilots in the Pacific. I think is very, very sexy indeed. There's that amazing memoir called Carrier Pilot. That our mate Roland White republished. It's brilliant. But anyway, so we can do all of those things, and it just makes me realise that there's still lots to say.
There's only ever lots to say. Right, okay. Well, that's all we've got time for this week.
We got through a few, though, didn't we?
Don't forget to go on the Patreon with the Jocks continues. If you're a patron, that carries on. I've been sent my deadline for recording the last 2 chapters as well, because we put it up before I completed it, which is quite good fun. Give us all something to concentrate the senses. And don't forget, We Have Ways Fest 3 is the weekend of the 8th to the 10th of September. That weekend next year. If you came to the previous festival, you know what in for. If you don't, if you didn't, then it's 50 talks from your favourite historians, living history demonstrations, great big olive green vehicles tumbling around in a field. And like-minded Second World War afflicted friends and family. It's been a pleasure talking to you all today. We'll see you again soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.